An elite hotel porter helps a shabby old woman. When she leaves, he finds a photo on the desk that makes him fall to his knees. An elderly woman walked into the most expensive hotel in the city. The manager wanted her gone, but one porter refused to let that happen. And the photograph she left behind, nobody in that building was ready for it. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments, what time is it and where are you watching from? Let's start. The lobby of the Grand Meridian was the kind of luxury that felt like a fortress. Every marble floor polished to a mirror, every chandelier catching the light, the low, dignified hum of people who owned the world and knew exactly how to keep it. The Grand Meridian wasn't just a hotel, it was a statement. And for James Carter, 35 years old, navy and gold uniform pressed sharp, white gloves spotless on his hands, it was his family's future. It was the mortgage, the groceries, and the quiet pride of a man who did his job better than anyone else. He had learned to carry the weight of his responsibilities with a silent, professional grace. He was assisting a guest at the gold leaf counter when the revolving glass doors turned, and the cold air pushed in ahead of her. The Grand Meridian did not just offer rooms, it sold the illusion of perfection, a world where the marble was perpetually chilled to the touch and the scent of expensive lilies hung heavy in the air. To the elite who stepped through its gilded arches, it was a fortress of exclusivity, a place where the outside world's grime and noise were silenced by the thick, velvet hum of absolute wealth. The lobby was a vast cathedral of gold leaf and crystal chandeliers that caught the light like frozen stars, reflecting off floors polished so deeply they looked like liquid amber. In this temple of status, everything was a statement, and the unspoken rule was simple: if you had to ask the price, you didn't belong. James Carter moved through this world like a shadow, indispensable yet nearly invisible. At 35, his life was measured in the sharp creases of his navy and gold uniform and the pristine whiteness of his gloves. He was the first face a billionaire saw upon arrival and the last they forgot upon departure, a man trained to anticipate a need before it was even whispered. For James, the Grand Meridian wasn't about the glamour, it was about the survival that happened behind the scenes. Every bag he carried, every door he held open with a practiced bow, was another step toward his family's security. It was the mortgage on a small house across town, the groceries in his pantry, and the future of his children that he protected with his silent, professional grace. He stood at his post near the gold leaf counter, a pillar of discipline amidst the swirling luxury. He watched the guests, men in tailored tuxedos and women draped in silks, moving with the effortless confidence of those who had never known a day of want. James understood the machinery of this place. He knew that the Grand Meridian ran on a strict diet of prestige and policy. There was no room for error, and certainly no room for anything that didn't fit the brand. He had spent years perfecting the art of being exactly what was expected, bearing his own struggles beneath a mask of impeccable service. But as the dinner rush began and the air grew thick with the scent of fine dining and power, James felt the familiar weight of his own integrity pressing against his ribs. He was a man of the shadows in a palace of light, waiting for the moment when the revolving glass doors would turn and bring the outside world crashing into his carefully constructed reality. The revolving glass doors groaned slightly as they turned, pulling a sharp, biting draft of the winter evening into the stifled warmth of the lobby. James felt the shift before he saw the cause, a subtle cooling of the room's temperature that seemed to make the wealthy guests at the marble counters pull their furs a little tighter. Then, she stepped into the light. Margaret Eleanor Whitfield looked like a shadow cast upon a sunlit wall. At 80 years old, her presence was a stark violation of the Grand Meridian's carefully curated perfection. She wore a brown coat that had seen too many winters, its hem frayed and stained by the city's slush, and a simple headscarf tied tightly under a chin mapped with the deep, indelible lines of a long and difficult life. In her hand, she clutched the handle of a battered leather travel bag, her knuckles white with the effort of carrying her entire world through a palace that was never built for her. She stood frozen on the inlaid mosaic floor, her eyes wide and clouded with an anxious uncertainty as they darted toward the towering crystal chandeliers. She looked like a woman who had walked into a dream she used to own but no longer recognized. The silence that followed her entrance was deafening. The low hum of the elite vanished, replaced by a collective, judgmental intake of breath. From the corner of his eye, James saw the hotel manager, Mrs. Sterling, already beginning to move. Her face was a mask of professional alarm, her mouth set in a thin, hard line as she prepared to erase this distraction from the lobby's view. But James found himself rooted to the spot, not by the manager's intensity, but by the raw, unguarded dignity in the old woman's posture. While everyone else saw a shabby intruder, James saw a person who looked as though she had finally reached the end of a very long journey. He knew that stepping forward would be a gamble. He knew that Mrs. Sterling expected him to escort the woman back out into the cold without a word. Yet, as Margaret's tired blue eyes met his, James felt the weight of his white gloves and his golden buttons, symbols of a service that was supposed to be for everyone, but was rarely given to those who needed it most. James saw Mrs. Sterling before she reached him. She was the Grand Meridian's senior administrator, a woman who treated the hotel's reputation like a holy relic that required constant protection from the unworthy. Her heels clicked against the marble with a sharp, rhythmic aggression, a sound that signaled trouble for anyone standing in her path. She stopped beside James, her body language radiating a cold, focused alarm. Without looking at him, she spoke in a low, clipped whisper that carried the weight of a direct threat. "James," she hissed, her hands gesturing urgently toward the elderly woman who remained frozen near the entrance. "What is that woman still doing in my lobby? She is a visible distraction." Guests are staring. James glanced at Margaret. She looked smaller now, her shoulders hunched as she clutched her battered bag, clearly aware of the sudden wall of judgment rising against her. "She looks exhausted, ma'am," James replied softly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline spiking in his chest. "I think she just needs a moment to find her bearings." Mrs. Sterling's mouth opened in shock, her eyes darting toward a group of wealthy guests who were indeed whispering and casting sideways glances at Margaret's frayed coat. "She needs to find her bearings on the sidewalk," the manager retorted, her voice rising in desperation. "We have a VIP arrival in 10 minutes, Mr. Sterling himself is expected. I want her escorted out, quietly and immediately. Do you understand your instructions, James?" James felt the familiar pressure of his role, the crushing realization of what was at stake. If he disobeyed, he wasn't just risking a reprimand, he was risking the livelihood that paid for his children's future and kept his world spinning. He looked at the white gloves on his hands, then back at the shabby woman who stood as a silent testament to a world the hotel preferred to forget. Behind Mrs. Sterling, he caught a glimpse of a well-dressed man in a tuxedo approaching from the elevators, the owner, his expression already clouding with a tense, alert suspicion as he spotted the anomaly in his perfect lobby. The moment of decision had arrived. The machinery of the Grand Meridian was demanding a cold, efficient removal, but James's conscience was screaming for something else. He looked at the manager, then at the owner, and finally at the woman who had no one in this room to speak for her. James did not move toward the door as instructed. Instead, he took a long, steady breath, the fabric of his navy and gold uniform tightening across his chest as he made a choice that defied every policy he had lived by for years. Ignoring Mrs. Sterling's sharp intake of breath, he stepped forward into the open expanse of the marble lobby, his white-gloved hands held out not to push, but to welcome. As he reached Margaret, he didn't whisper for her to leave. Instead, he sank into a deep, practiced bow, the kind usually reserved for heads of state or the hotel's most prestigious shareholders. "Good evening, madam," James said, his voice ringing out with a warmth that cut through the sterile, judgmental silence of the room. "Welcome to the Grand Meridian. It is an honor to have you with us tonight." The elderly woman's eyes flickered with a sudden, piercing clarity, her small, guarded frame straightening ever so slightly as she looked at him. She reached out a trembling hand, and James gently took the weight of her battered leather bag from her. It was unexpectedly heavy, filled with the unseen gravity of a long journey, but James carried it as if it were made of gold. Behind him, he could feel the manager's shock radiating like heat and the tuxedo owner's eyes boring into his back. He was breaking the gold standard of the palace, choosing a shabby stranger over the brand's rigid image. He knew that by offering her his arm and guiding her toward the center of the room rather than the exit, he was putting his family's future on the line. Yet, as he felt her small hand rest on his navy sleeve, the anxious and uncertain lines on her face softened. "Thank you, young man," she whispered, her voice like wind over dry leaves. James didn't look back at the scowling management. He simply led her toward a quiet, velvet-lined corner of the lobby, treating her with a level of reverence that suggested she wasn't just a guest, she was the most important person in the building. James guided Margaret to a secluded, velvet-lined alcove, tucked away from the prying eyes of the wealthy elite. He could feel the manager's glare and the owner's suspicious watch from the shadows, but his focus remained entirely on the woman whose hands were still shaking from the cold. Without a word to his superiors, James signaled a junior waiter, using his own tip money to order a tray of the hotel's finest Earl Grey and a plate of warm scones, the kind of service usually reserved for those who paid thousands for a suite. As he poured the tea, Margaret's anxious and uncertain expression began to thaw. She reached for the cup with reverence, her lined face softening as the steam rose between them. "You shouldn't be doing this," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant hum of the lobby music. "They want me gone." James simply smiled, the mask of the professional porter finally giving way to the man beneath. "In this hotel, madam, everyone is a guest," he replied softly, though he knew the lie could cost him his mortgage and his children's future. From across the room, the man in the tuxedo, the owner, watched with a tense, alert intensity. He saw James leaning in, listening as Margaret spoke in hushed tones about the way the light used to hit the lobby before the marble was replaced. She spoke of the hotel not as a business, but as a living memory. Every second James spent at her side was a second he was defying the gold standard of the Meridian, yet he couldn't bring himself to walk away. He was seeing the person, not the shabby coat, and for the first time in his career, the service felt real. As she finished her tea, Margaret reached into her worn brown coat and pulled out a small, cream-colored envelope. She set it on the table between them but didn't open it. "I came to see if the heart of this place was still beating," she said, her eyes meeting James's with a weight he couldn't yet understand. "And I think I found it." The quiet moment in the alcove was shattered by the sharp click of leather soles on marble. The owner, a man whose presence usually commanded a wave of bowing heads, stepped into the soft light of the corner. His tuxedo was flawless, his face a mask of disciplined irritation. Behind him, the manager hovered, her hands clasped tightly, eyes darting between James and the shabby woman who had overstayed her unwelcome welcome. "Carter," the owner said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He didn't look at Margaret, he looked at the half-empty teacup and the crumbs of the scones James had bought with his own money. "A word. Now." James stood, his white-gloved hands folding behind his back as he stepped into the owner's shadow. He could feel the eyes of the wealthy guests drifting toward them. The stakes had never been higher. "Sir," James began, keeping his voice even, "the guest was in need of assistance. You were simply disregarding every protocol we have for assistance," the owner interrupted, finally casting a sharp, alert glance at Margaret. He looked at her not as a person, but as an anomaly, a smudge on a masterpiece. "This is an elite establishment, James. We do not run a charity. Do you have any idea what this looks like to our shareholders?" Margaret sat silently, her shoulders hunched as she clutched the cream-colored envelope. She looked up at the owner, not with fear, but with a strange, piercing sadness, the way one might look at a child who had forgotten his manners. The owner's expression flickered for a brief second, a flash of recognition so fast it was gone before James could be sure of it. "I'll see to her myself," the manager added, stepping forward with an urgent, explaining gesture to the owner. "James, go back to your post. We'll discuss the future of your position in the morning." James felt a cold realization sink in. He had protected her dignity, but the brand was striking back. He looked at Margaret one last time, her anxious eyes searching his face, and then he bowed, not to the owner, but to her. He walked back to the gold-leaf counter, his back straight, even as the world he had built for his family began to crumble around him. The following morning, the hotel lobby was hushed, the early light filtering through the high windows in long, cold shafts that illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air. Margaret Eleanor Whitfield was gone. She had checked out in the grey hours of the dawn, moving like a ghost through the halls she had walked with such heavy uncertainty the night before. James stood at the front desk, his heart heavy. The manager had ignored him all morning, a silence that felt more like a sentence than a reprieve. He had been assigned to clear the suite Margaret had occupied, a final, humbling task before his inevitable meeting with the board. As he rode the gilded elevator up, the silence of the hotel felt oppressive, a far cry from the music of the dinner rush. When he entered the room, he expected the usual mess of a high-end guest, but the suite was eerily pristine. The bed was made with military precision, the air smelled faintly of the tea he had served her. Then, he saw it. Resting on the dark mahogany of the desk, perfectly scented, was the cream-colored envelope she had held so tightly. James approached it with a sense of dread. He picked it up, his white gloves feeling clumsy against the fine paper. Inside, there was no money, no complaint, only a small, stiff square of cardboard. He pulled it out and felt the breath leave his lungs. It was an old black and white photograph, the edges soft and yellowed with time. In the photo, a young girl with a bright, defiant smile stood on a dirt plot where the Grand Meridian now loomed. Beside her was a tall, proud man in a simple workman's shirt, the hotel's legendary founder. But it was the writing on the back that made James's knees buckle. To the one who saw the person, not the coat. "My father built these walls on the promise of home. Tonight, for the first time in 50 years, I felt like I was back. You are the heart he wanted for this place." James collapsed onto the small chair, the photograph trembling in his hand. The shabby woman wasn't an intruder, she was the legacy. She was the reason this marble palace existed, and he was the only one who had treated her like she belonged. James sat in the heavy silence of the suite, the black and white photograph feeling like a live wire in his hand. He looked at the young girl's face again, the same defiant spark in the eyes he had seen last night behind the veil of 80 years. The man standing beside her in the photo, the founder whose bronze bust sat in the lobby as a symbol of corporate power, wasn't just a face on a plaque. To Margaret, he was father. The weight of the secret was staggering. For years, the Grand Meridian had marketed itself as a self-made empire of stone and glass, but this photo told the story of the soil beneath it, a story of a daughter who had been erased from the history books while the hotel grew into a cold, diamond-hard fortress. James knew that if he brought this photo downstairs, he would be exposing a truth that the current ownership had spent decades burying. He thought of his mortgage, his children's school fees, and the manager's threat to his position. The safest thing to do was to tuck the photo into his pocket and let the legend of the shabby old woman fade into hotel gossip. But then he looked at his own white gloves. They were the gloves of a servant, yes, but he realized they were also the gloves of a guardian. He had spent his life protecting the brand, but Margaret had asked him to protect the heart. He stood up, his knees still weak but his resolve hardening. He didn't return to the porter's station. Instead, he walked toward the executive wing, the photograph clutched tightly. He passed the manager, Mrs. Sterling, who was in the middle of an urgent explanation to a group of investors. She stopped mid-sentence, her face reddening as she saw James heading straight for the owner's private office. "James! Where do you think you're going?" she hissed, reaching out to grab his arm. James didn't stop. He didn't even look at her. He pushed past the heavy oak doors, entering the owner's office just as the man in the tuxedo was pouring a drink, his back to the door. "I told you to wait for the morning, Carter," the owner said, his voice cold and weary without turning around. "You need to see this, sir," James said, his voice ringing with a clarity that finally commanded the room. He walked to the desk and laid the black and white photograph directly over the owner's leather-bound ledger. "I found her. Or rather, she found us." The owner turned, a sharp retort on his lips, but as his eyes fell on the image, the glass in his hand rattled. The tense, alert suspicion in his face collapsed into a pale, hollow shock. The owner's hand froze mid-air. He didn't pick up the photograph, he stared at it as if it were a ghost that had finally tracked him down. The silence in the office was no longer the heavy silence of authority, but the hollow, ringing quiet of a man realizing his throne was built on a forgotten grave. "Where did you get this?" the owner whispered, his voice stripped of its corporate steel. "She left it for me," James replied, his voice steady. "She didn't come here for a free meal or a room, sir. She came to see if the promise her father made, that this would be a place of dignity, was still alive. We almost failed her. I almost failed her." At that moment, Mrs. Sterling burst into the room, her face flushed with indignation. "Sir, I'm so sorry. James has been completely insubordinate. I'll have security escort him out immediately." "Quiet, Sarah," the owner snapped, though he still hadn't looked away from the photo. He finally reached out, his fingers trembling as he touched the image of the young Margaret. He looked at the founder, then at the girl, then at James. For the first time in years, the owner's shoulders dropped. The well-dressed man in the background of the hotel story was suddenly just a man holding a heavy secret. "She was supposed to be gone," he murmured. "We were told there were no heirs left. We built this empire on the assumption that the past was dead." He looked up at James, really looking at him, not as a porter, but as a mirror. "You saw her," the owner said quietly. "In a room full of people who get paid to see everything, you were the only one who actually looked at her." The transformation was immediate. The owner stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city. There will be no termination, Sarah, he said to the stunt manager. In fact, James is to be promoted to guest relations director, effective immediately. And the boardroom? I want it cleared. We are going to turn it into a gallery. The Whitfield Gallery. James felt the air return to his lungs. The weight of his mortgage, his mother's bills, and his fear of the future didn't vanish, but they suddenly felt manageable. He wasn't just a man in a navy and gold uniform anymore, he was the bridge between the hotel's cold present and its warm, human past. Somewhere out in the city, Margaret Eleanor Whitfield was walking a little straighter, her battered back a little lighter. She had found what she was looking for. And inside the Grand Meridian, as James tucked his white gloves into his belt, he knew that some nights change a shift, but some nights change a legacy. This was the second kind.